Well, I guess more or less what I have to say this evening is a kind of a continuation of the themes of Jonathan's remarks. Before we plunge in, as we will in the next few days, into the operational and chemical and botanical details of ayahuasca analogs and that sort of thing, what we're doing here is sort of laying out the general territory, both the history and the psychology of what these things have been about. My interest lies in that domain in two specific areas. First of all, the impact of hallucinogens on culture and the way in which they've shaped culture. This is something that is not generally thought about in Western historical thinking, because Western civilization has evolved over the past couple of thousand years at least, almost in the complete absence of strong hallucinogenic plant experiences. Every culture seems to identify certain intoxicants in its environment, which it then takes to itself and then demonizes all other intoxicants. And the unhappy choices of Western civilization were alcohol, first and foremost, and since the conquest, since the discovery of the New World, tobacco and sugar, and since the close of World War II, television. So these kinds of drug choices have tended to narrow and canalize consciousness rather than expand it. And the peculiar narrow-mindedness of Western civilization is almost its hallmark, that an obsession with matter, an obsession with a reductionist methodology that believes that things are best understood by taking them apart and reducing them to their substituent components. These habits of mind that have arisen out of habits of chemical relationship have given Western culture its peculiarly lethal tinge. And I've observed this with puzzlement for my entire adult life. I'm sure you have as well. It seems to me that if we are willing to see hallucinogens from outside a Western value system, to see them as more important, more inimical to the core of the cultural enterprise, the way they're seen in shamanic societies, tribal societies, then there is possibly more of a handle on our human circumstance. So most of what we'll be talking about here is various ways to get high, and then what do you think about it. But a more basic question, or something which should always be kept in mind, is first and foremost the peculiarity of the human situation generally. I mean, how does it happen that of thousands and thousands of animal and plant species on this planet, one particular primate has broken from the pack, as it were, and elaborated an incredibly complicated repertoire of behaviors, technologies, languages, and states of mind that then permit what is essentially an arboreal tropical animal, a primate, to build a globally encompassing civilization based on the instantaneous transfer of information from one point to another. This is an extraordinary phenomenon, perhaps accomplishment, when placed in contrast to the rest of organic nature. The songs of the whales, the pheromones of the insects, the migratory instincts of birds, all of these complex behaviors from the animal world nevertheless have no relationship to what we see as a very typical expression of the human world. There seems to be in our species an ontological break with the rest of organic nature, to the point where in earlier and more philosophically naive times, it was simply assumed then that we were not products of the environment in quite the same way, that in fact we were the special project of God Almighty, somehow different from the rest of nature. And on the basis of this ontological distinction from the rest of nature, Judeo-Christian monotheism, inflated by Greek science, permitted an attitude toward ourselves and the world that created toxic environments, a destroyed atmosphere, an incredibly inflated population, acceptance of human suffering and misery that was made then the basis for religious ontologies worldwide. It's a given of Western religions that we are in a fallen state of some sort. And it is a given of Eastern religion that suffering is inevitable. These are attitudes toward our condition that are very different from the attitudes that we take toward the supposed integration into the rest of nature that other animal and plant species experience. So it's almost as though there is some factor in our evolutionary history that we've lost touch with, or that we no longer understand, and that we have to create mythological explanations for man's fall, so forth and so on, and that this secret factor, if we could but understand it and come to terms with it, would illuminate our personal, individual existential situation and the anxiety that now gathers itself ever more intensely around the human future, where it's now possible to rationally assume that there is no human future of any recognizable sort, that democratic values and freedom of thought and self-expression are transient post-Renaissance values that will inevitably be subsumed under media-driven and propaganda-driven regimentation made necessary by the shrinking environment, the limited resource base, and the ability of mass media to express male-dominant ideology and enforce it from the top down. So this, as I said, is a continuation of what was said earlier, but maybe in a broader context. I wrote about this in a book I wrote called Food of the Gods, where what I wanted to argue, and I will just lay it out briefly here tonight, and if it's interesting we can discuss it in the course of the week, but I think our ambivalence, our anxiety, our excitement, our enthusiasm about these hallucinogenic plants has to do with the fact that we somehow intuitively sense that they are spun in to the mystery of our humanness and our uniqueness and our special position in the natural world. All animal species tend to evolve into a given niche and then to genetically stabilize themselves there and to remain at equilibrium unless the evolutionary niche is disrupted by external forces, which can be climatological or, largely climatological. And I think this is what happened to us as well. What we represent is some kind of higher animal that has undergone an extraordinary transformation as a result of a kind of disequilibrium in our lifestyle. We are primates, and there are other higher primates on this planet. But when we compare ourselves to them, we see that they are all clustered together over here, and we seem to have ended up in a completely different category. And I think the reason for this can actually be traced to these hallucinogenic plants and our unique relationship to them. And so I see hallucinogens on one level as offering a way out for Darwinian evolutionary theory as modified by molecular genetics to show how a creature like ourselves could emerge from the natural world and emerge with the rapidity that the fossil record indicates we emerged. The great embarrassment of evolutionary theory is the human brain and human beings. If this planet were simply coral reefs, prairie dogs, ungulate herds, anthills, Darwinian evolutionary mechanics as modified by molecular genetics is completely adequate to explain all of that. The age of the Earth, the rates of genetic drift, the incidence of incoming cosmic radiation, all these factors nicely fit together to produce a picture of slowly evolving, slowly speciating animal life. The embarrassment in all of this is the sudden doubling of the brain of a particular developmental line of higher primates in just a couple of million years. And in my book, I quote the evolutionary biologist Lumholtz, who says the sudden explosive doubling of the human brain size represents the most radical transformation of a major organ of a higher animal in the entire fossil record. This would be embarrassment enough for evolutionary theory were it just as it stands, but when placed in the context of the fact that this is the organ which produced that evolutionary theory, the embarrassment becomes acute. Do you understand how that works? I'm sure you do. So I went back and looked at early human evolution, trying to understand how hallucinogens might have impacted on it. Now, you might think that this is an area where there are many closely thought out and closely fought theories that are various approximations of the truth. It turns out this is not the case. It turns out that if you don't think hallucinogens had an impact on early human evolution, then your choices in terms of explanations for this rapid burst of neural arborization, elaboration of languages and behaviors, etc., are woefully limited. incredibly limited. For example, at the moment, the best competing theory of the non-psychedelic varieties says that the reason we have such an advanced brain structure is because being small and physically rather unimpressive, and yet needing to predate on very large animals, we coordinated the ability to throw objects with great accuracy. And in fact, it is true that no other animal can throw a small round object as hard and as far with as much force as a human being. This would make of the big league baseball pitcher the evolutionary paradigm of human perfection. But if you've ever watched these guys chew and spit on the mound, you wonder then why Milton, why Newton, why all the rest of it. It seems like an incredible embarrassment of riches simply to hit a woolly mammoth between the eyes with a small round object. And in fact, I think it's almost a facetious suggestion. The truth is, nobody has a clue. This is the great mystery of evolutionary biology. But it's not so mysterious if we are willing to drop the ordinary Western biases against hallucinogenic plants and try to see how they might have impacted early human evolution. And I'll give you a scenario that I think basically fits the facts of the matter. First of all, without even concentrating on hallucinogens, it's important to notice that all animals tend to specialize their diets. This is especially true of insects, but it's true of most animals, that they have a very selected diet and that they will stick with that. And that often, in the case of insects especially, if the food plant is not present, no adjustment is possible. The behavioral creode is so deep that in the absence of the correct food plant, the only thing that can happen is that the animal dies. Looking at this, evolutionary biologists have assumed that this is a strategy to hold down exposure to mutagenic influence in the environment. You may, if you haven't studied evolution in any detail, have the impression that mutation is largely caused by radiation. In other words, incidental cosmic rays striking genetic material in a random fashion, producing mutations, most of which are lethal, some of which confer adaptive success. This is only partially true. A truer way of describing what's going on is to say that stress causes mutation, and that incidental cosmic radiation is only one kind of stress. There are other kinds of stress, specifically chemical stress. And I believe that what happened to our species is that we were a primate in a climaxed environmental niche in the rainforest canopies of Africa somewhere between 5 and 7 million years ago. This adaptation reached its maxima, and then it began to be interfered with and disrupted by nothing more profound than climatological fluctuations of the planet, which have been part of the life of the planet since its condensation. In this case, a tendency toward increased dryness, that though it began several million years ago, persists right up to the present moment. This is the cause, complicated by human factors, of the spreading of the Sahara Desert, and many of the sub-Saharan famines are in fact simply that the desert continues to spill over its margins and to spread itself. The earth, even 50,000 years ago, was a much greener wetter place from Morocco across to Manchuria, the very area of the planet which becomes the theater for human emergence. Well, higher animals are not as canalized in their behavior as insects, for example, so that when an animal like a primate comes under dietary pressure, rather than just lying down and dying, a new behavior is instead coaxed out of this crisis. And the behavior is a tendency toward a broadening of dietary tastes. In other words, a tendency toward becoming omnivorous. And this is one of the characteristics of human beings that is so remarkable, that we accept hundreds of items as food. We even accept variety itself as a positive value in the process of relating to food. We all know that, Western civilization in its quest for spices transformed itself in the later Middle Ages. This tendency toward a broadened diet, the natural consequence of that is a much greater exposure to mutagenic influence compacted into a shorter period of time than would be the normal course of animal evolution. And around the time that we began noticing that the arboreal environment of the rainforest was becoming limited, we began descending from the trees, at first very experimentally, and then over time with a greater and greater commitment to the newly evolving grassland environment. And in that same time frame, we began to experiment with new kinds of foods. Root foods, for example, which had not been part of the arboreal diet, which had been a diet of insects, fruits, and possibly small animals. Now, roots are a place where many, many higher plants sequester so-called secondary and tertiary compounds. A spectacular example that makes the point, I think, is, as you probably know, birth control pills like orthonovum are made from Dioscorea vines. In fact, these Dioscorea vines are grown on plantations in Mexico, huge plantations. But Dioscorea is the same family that contains sweet potatoes and yams, which in the tropics are a major food source for many human populations in Africa and Polynesia. In South America, it tends to be replaced by yucca, Manihot esculenta, but the tendency toward root foods among tropical peoples is pan-global. Well, imagine a proto-human or early human population of yam eaters getting into a strain of Dioscorea vines that are heavily loaded with the kind of steroids that occur in birth control tablets. What you would have then is dietary chaos, child spacing, fertility, lactation, pregnancy. All of these things would be interfered with, in most cases in a lethal fashion. But of course, evolution makes its way on that 1 or 2% of mutation that is not lethal, but confers some kind of adaptive advantage. Well, I use the example of the sweet potatoes just to give you a feeling for the argument before turning to the psychedelic compounds. What we're looking for is something which would interrupt normal behavior patterns and replace them with behavior patterns with an increased adaptive advantage. And I think that if you fairly look at the candidates, psilocybin emerges as a very strong candidate for the chemical trigger for the kinds of behaviors and social adaptations that characterize the transition from a higher animal to early human beings. And I'll lay it out for you here. First of all, and fortunately, the first effect that you encounter with psilocybin is an increase in visual acuity at low doses. And let me say, the reason I focused in on mushrooms in this way is because whatever this hypothesized psychedelic trigger in the early human environment was, it had to be a grassland inhabitant, because that's where the theater of this transition occurred. It had to be plentiful, otherwise, if it were a very rare plant, its impact would be incremental and it would be swamped by other factors. It must require no preparation whatsoever. Concentration, cooking, combinatory approaches, those are all later phases of culture. So it has to be plentiful, it has to be noticeable, it can't require any preparation, and it has to be a denizen of the grassland, and it has to have a psychoactive compound in sufficient concentration that it is active in a mode that can easily be gathered by animals of reasonably low attention span. Well, I submit to you that when you place all that together, it has to be a psilocybin-containing mushroom. So then, picture this situation. We are making our way on to the newly evolving grassland. In that same grassland, new kinds of animals are evolving. The multi-stomached ungulate animals that don't really appear in the fossil record before 10 to 15 million years ago. They antedate the human emergence, but they are a very modern and complex kind of mammal, not to be confused with rodents and carnivorous hunters and that sort of animal. Psilocybin conveys visual acuity. The impact of this on a hunting-gathering culture seems to me obvious. Visual acuity is the key to success in the hunt. Success in the hunt is the key to securing an expanded protein base. An expanded protein base is the key to bringing your own offspring to sexual maturity. And that's the name of the game in the evolutionary game. Once you bring your own offspring to sexual maturity, you are essentially dealt out of the biological game, and the pressure comes on to the next generation. So psilocybin in that situation would have been a factor that those animals willing to accept it into their diet would have had greater success in bringing their own offspring to reproductive age. Those animals that did not accept it into the diet would be slowly outbred by the more successful hunters and gatherers who were essentially availing themselves of a technology, the equivalent of chemical binoculars available in the environment. And this visual acuity increase induced by psilocybin was studied in the 1960s by Roland Fisher, who created an apparatus where they could deform parallel lines. They gave graduate students small doses of psilocybin and placebo and asked people to press a button when they perceived that the lines were no longer parallel. And they discovered that on psilocybin you can pick this up much faster than in an ordinary state of consciousness. And Fisher said to me when I talked to him about this, he said, so you see, here is a case where drugs definitely, we have proven, give you a truer picture of reality than if you have avoided the drug. So it's a very important point, because often the charge is made against drug use that it's some form of flight from reality. Well, it turns out in this particular case it brought reality literally into sharper focus. So that is the first factor, situation in which psilocybin would have a positive impact on the human species and coax us into a relationship with it. And I'm talking here of doses of maybe 3 to 5 milligrams. These are doses that one would expect a foraging animal to unconsciously imbibe, just in the course of eating things in the environment. This level of psilocybin might ebb and flow, even in an animal that had made no conscious decision to eat mushrooms. Well, so then, carrying the argument a little further, at slightly higher doses, let's say 5 to 15 milligrams, this is still sub-threshold psychedelic doses. Psilocybin, like many CNS stimulants, central nervous system stimulants, has the effect of creating arousal, which means two things. It means restlessness, an inability to sit still, a projection of attention into the environment, and in the male, erection, arousal, straightforwardly, especially in highly sexed animals like primates. This would be a factor. So place this fact in concert with what I said earlier about increased food gathering ability, and you have an aphrodisiac combination. There's no combination for the promotion of sexual activity like a full belly and sexual arousal. So it becomes a second factor promoting the outbreeding of the non-psilocybin-using members of the tribe. They are simply having what primatologists call a lesser incidence of successful copulation. And this is, of course, the name of the evolutionary game. The more copulations, the more inseminations, the more pregnancies, the more individuals that are born who may grow to maturity. So it was a second factor tending to outbreed the non-psilocybin-using members of the population. Now, at higher doses, above 15 milligrams, hunting becomes unthinkable, and even sexual activity becomes a fairly remote possibility, because you're just basically nailed to the ground around the campfire, or if you haven't discovered fire yet, you're just simply nailed to the ground, and you are then swept away in this boundary-dissolving experience, which we call the psychedelic experience, and which we, with our space shuttles and long-base interferometry and DNA sequencing and so forth and so on, are still in awe of. We don't have a clue as to, what the real epistemic implications of the psychedelic experience are at high doses, and I'm sure they didn't either. And the natural response to this overwhelming transformation of the perceptual pleroma is awe, wonder, amazement. And the institutionalization of awe and amazement is the basis for religion, ritual, and a sense of the indwelling of the holy. Also, and again, psilocybin is unique in this sense, or in my experience. I suppose it happens on other things, but psilocybin is fairly reliable. It induces glossolalia. It induces spontaneous language-like activity, bursts of vocalization. And I would submit that probably glossolalia is far older than what we call language, that the notion of attaching meaning to small mouth noises is a fairly late adumbration of the small mouth noise activity that human beings love to engage in. And it is language, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that is the behavior, and notice that it is a behavior. A person sitting next to you on the bus who is mute does not betray this handicap until you try to engage them in conversation. Language is a behavior, but it's the behavior which carries us way, way out of the realm of other animal activities. I mean, the songs of whales and the chirping of dolphins and the pheromones of termites aside, it is nothing like the linguistic activities of human beings, which we have adumbrated to the point where we even create symbolic notational systems, writing, hieroglyphs, rebus writing, such as we'll see up at the ruin. It's our relationship to language and our ability essentially to unite ourselves with each other telepathically through the downloading of internal states into small mouth noises with a shared symbolic interpretation that we then reconstruct when we hear each other's small mouth noises, that has allowed us to create a global civilization. And some commentators think that language may be no more than 35,000 to 40,000 years old. That makes it only 4 times older than the wheel. That means that, it's as artificial as any other technology. There is another school of thought that holds that language goes back much further, but no one claims that it goes back further than 1 million years, in which case, it is a product of the last geological instant. So, to sum up this part and then draw the conclusion, I think that one hope for the legitimizing of the psychedelic experience, and one hope for placing it in a new context that will not see it as marginal, escapist, maladaptive, and somehow perverse, is to argue that without this in our past, humanness itself would not have emerged from animal organization. And here's the deal then, in the way in which it has implication for our modern dilemma. All primates have what are called dominance hierarchies, male dominance hierarchies. Even back to squirrel monkeys and the old world primates, this is happening. And it's an unfortunate aspect of human culture as we sit here this evening. Because of male dominance, we have an endless history of warfare, a history of marginalizing women, homosexuals, the elderly. All of these people have had to take their marching orders from the hard-bodied, long-fanged young males of the pack. And it has been a tremendous drag on human creativity and the evolution of what we laughingly call human dignity. Well, I would like to argue then that several times today you've heard people use the words boundary dissolving. I would like to argue that aside from all the other things which I've mentioned this evening that psilocybin has done to us, in that early situation, it acted to dissolve boundaries. Specifically, the boundary that it is most corrosive of is the boundary that defines the ego from the rest of the personality structure. The ego is a kind of calcareous growth. It's like a tumor. It grows in the personality in the absence of the psychedelic experience. And in this period, when we were evolving into the grassland, domesticating cattle, taking psilocybin, we evolved an egalitarian, orgiastic, nomadic, non-material culture that was related to the domestication of cattle, the worship of a great horned goddess, and the dissolution of personal boundaries through hallucinogenic ecstasy. And in that window of opportunity, which probably opened about 100,000 to maybe 200,000 years ago, and which closed as recently as 15 to 20,000 years ago, in that window of opportunity, we evolved altruism, community values, courage, love, a sense of respect for each other. In short, everything that we define as human and worth preserving, the higher spiritual values that distinguish us from the rest of the great apes and the rest of animal nature, all evolved under the aegis of this psilocybin-mediated symbiosis between the fungi, the human beings, and the cattle. And a kind of paradise existed, a paradise of individual completion, of sexual and social egalitarianism, a world possessing theater, poetry, dance, humor, astronomy, mathematics, higher values. But unfortunately, this was not to last forever. And ironically, the forces which destroyed it were the very forces that created it. Remember, I said that what forced us out of the trees and onto the grasslands was the drying of the African continent, where it had created grasslands cut by bubbling streams with wooded uplands, the Eden of the psilocybin partnership paradise that Rian Eisler and Maria Gimbutas have talked about. That same process of drying eventually turned the grasslands to desert, and the mushrooms, far from being easily available and plentiful year-round, began to become seasonal and geographically restricted to the rain shadows of mountains and this sort of thing. It's at this point, then, in the absence of the mushroom, that these genetically programmed male-dominant behaviors re-emerged. They had never been taken out of the animal. They had simply been medicated into being submerged in the social organization. But they were not genetically stripped out of the species, and as soon as this symbiotic relationship between human beings, cattle, and mushrooms were disrupted, these male dominance patterns re-emerged. And we're talking, 10 to 15,000 years ago. The invention of agriculture, specifically. If you look at the stratigraphy of the Nile Valley, before 10,000 BC, there was no human habitation in the Nile Valley. It was probably a malarial lowland, a wet river valley, a fairly unhealthy place. And people lived in the western grasslands. When those grasslands turned to desert, under nutritional pressure, people took their vast repertoire of information that they had created over millennia as hunter-gatherers and collapsed it into an intensive involvement with 5 or 6 plant species. Wheat, rye, cereals, that then become the basis for early agriculture. And again, you can see how consciousness in a way is its own worst enemy. there came a point in the yearly nomadic rounds of early human beings when they noticed, and it was probably women who made this connection, they noticed that in the middens, in the trash of previous year's camps, food plants were to be found. The uncooked grains of year-old meals turn into small crops of cereal grains. As soon as it was understood that you could insert cereal into the earth and reap a crop, and this was probably understood at approximately the same time that it was noticed that the sexual act was a necessary concomitant to pregnancy, that realization made it possible then for men to trace lines of male paternity. The interesting thing you see about an orgiastic social structure is that children then are not born to a specific father. Women know whose children are theirs because they see the children come out of their bodies. But men do not have the notion of male paternity in an orgiastic society. Once you, and notice the concern deepening through Western history to control female sexual activity, especially where dynastic concerns are strong. This is because male paternity is a very strong indicator, or concerns for male paternity are a very strong indicator of the reemergence of this style of dominance hierarchy that had been previously suppressed. Well, in a world of without refrigeration, your strategies are very limited for doing this. You can only dry mushrooms and keep them dry if you have a technology of very tight form-fitting boxes and gourd lids. And this seems to come later than this period of culture that I'm talking about. So in the absence of that kind of technology, excuse me, the only way you could hope to preserve mushrooms is by preserving them in some kind of medium. And the obvious medium is honey. And to this day, in third world countries, mushrooms are often preserved in honey. The problem with this is that honey itself has the potential to transmute itself chemically into a psychoactive substance, into mead. Honey ferments, especially the watery honeys of Aboriginal people, which are not like the super thick honey that you get at the A&P. These watery honeys would tend to transmute themselves into primitive alcohol. And alcohol, like psilocybin, has a whole set of cultural traits which it suppresses and enhances, but different cultural traits. The cultural traits accentuated by alcohol are specifically two. It gives you an enhanced and false sense of verbal accomplishment, at the same time that it lowers sensitivity to social cueing. You can see this at work in any singles bar on a busy Friday night. I mean, guys who would normally have enough sense to keep their mouths shut and their head down are pushing hard on women and ignoring social cues such as get lost. So the alcohol had a tendency to accentuate this male dominance tendency. And very suddenly, 15 to 10,000 years ago, a huge new set of social behaviors and institutions flower into existence. Agriculture. Agriculture means the end of nomadism, because agriculture, especially in its early phase, was such a successful strategy for producing food that you produce immense surpluses. Well, then you can't take it with you. So instead you build a grain tower such as at Jericho, the oldest building in the world, 11,000 years ago, the grain tower at Jericho. Agriculture promotes surpluses, it promotes sedentary living. Following quickly on the heels of that is role specialization, male kingship, urbanization, standing armies, slavery, and when you've got all that in place, you have all the building blocks necessary to build the kind of maladaptive and neurotic civilizations of which we are the unhappy inheritors. All you need to toss into that mix is a phonetic alphabet, and you're off and running toward the differential calculus and the atom bomb. And this is, in fact, I think, what happened. We, the inheritors of global civilization, are like the children of a dysfunctional family. Something was taken from us in our infancy, 10 to 15,000 years ago. We are the victims of a kind of abuse. And one of the, we've talked of many unique behaviors of human beings here. Also to be put in that category is our obsession with drugs and our ability to addict to all kinds of drugs and also to all kinds of behaviors. I mean, we not only addict to substances, we addict very strongly to behaviors. A guy opens the front door of his home in the morning, and if the paper isn't lying rolled at his feet, he stalks back into the house, now a menace to wife and child, simply because his expectation of a certain thrill has not been met. So, and I think this has to do with the fact that we are seeking something that we lost. And we try alcohol, we try morphine-based drugs, we try money, we try sadomasochism, we try piling up art collections, buying Mercedes, doing all these things, and nothing quite takes the edge away, because we can't find our way back to the original source of our satisfaction. And perhaps we find it briefly in orgasm, but orgasm is a fleeting and often dysfunctional phenomenon among modern people, I think, especially when compared with Aboriginal people. So I spend all this time on this not only because it's interesting to figure out how human beings emerged from primates, but also because I think a full teasing apart of how that happened will set up signposts for how we might find our way out of the nightmare of modernity. We now have an enormous cultural momentum built up behind these lethal social styles and behaviors, like male dominance, like environmental destruction, product fetishism, materialism, ego, and ego. All of this is tremendously exacerbated by modern civilization. And if we had 1,000 years to work this out, we might be able to save ourselves from Armageddon without recourse to the original sacraments and the original chemical symbiosis. But given that we probably have 40 or 50 years, I think we need to think about the role these things played in early human development. I'm not the first person to put this together. I mean, I've done it in high detail and with psilocybin, but 20 years ago, in a book called The Ghost in the Machine, Arthur Koestler observed that we human beings, he didn't single out the males, but we human beings are hardwired for murder. That's what we do best, is bash each other's brains out. And that was fine for the Middle Stone Age, but it's entirely inappropriate in a global society. And he suggested pharmacological intervention. I mean, he was thinking in terms of some kind of tranquilizer or something like that. I think we need to genuflect a little more deeply to the heights of human nature as well as to the depths. And I think it is very interesting that in 1953, the Watsons, exploring one of the last unexplored or very little contacted areas of the New World, came upon what they called the mushroom religion or the mushroom sacrament, but what in fact operationally was the body of Eros, sleeping since, metaphorically, the fall of Atlantis, sleeping there in the Mexican highlands. They brought it back to modern civilization, and now groups like this, small groups of people, individuals taking psilocybin, anthropologists who in the last 100 years have brought the news of the use of plant hallucinogens in many Aboriginal cultures, all of this data, information, technology, and plants, fungi, arriving on the plate of Western civilization at the same time. And, as H.G. Wells said, history, and he meant Western history, is a race between education and catastrophe. It's going to be a photo finish, folks. And my interest in this field is because this is the only, and by this I mean the hallucinogenic plants, are the only factor I've ever seen that would turn an individual around in about 6.5 hours from being, a jerk to being someone who at least had the concept that it would be nice to be a decent human being. And it's a mass turning of that sort is probably the only thing which will save us from the cultural juggernaut that we have set in motion over the past couple of thousand years. So that's all I really have to say about that. It's just an argument for the importance of psychedelics that tries to transcend the personal, tries to lift it above the level of a human rights issue, and to say, the very basis of humanness lies in these things, and the very basis for human hope lies in their rediscovery and their reassimilation into the human experience. I don't expect us to start herding our cattle across the plains of Africa again. That's gone forever. But there must be ways that we can overcome our obsession with male dominance, monotheism, sexual exclusivity, product fetishism, so forth and so on. And I think the way through is to let the mushrooms speak through us of the agenda of the Gaian mind, because that's what it was. That's what the mushroom message was in prehistory. It was a message of Gaian accommodation that allowed poetry, theater, humor, mathematics, human hope, human fear and disappointment to coexist with the larger concerns of the rest of the living earth in a relationship of dynamic respect rather than a relationship of plunder and mass destruction, which has characterized the monotheistic, monogamistic, scientific, phonetic alphabet-driven, dysfunctional civilizations that arose once the connection with the mushroom was broken. So we can discuss all this over the course of the week. We will get deeply into the specifics, but I wanted to give you this context because this is really why I think this matters. Thank you very much.
Like your program Time Wave Zero, we don't even have that long. We have about 30, we have, 30 years, right?
More like 18 years.
18. So is it possible perhaps that psilocybin is making its rightful appearance according to a plan? You know, that it wasn't discovered by accident, but that it's here to catalyze the millennium?
It could well be. I mean, it could well be. I mean, it's horrifying that it waited so long. I would like it to have, too bad it didn't get rolling in 1500. But, what do I know? Maybe it loves a photo finish. But yes, I mean, I made reference to this, that news of all of these hallucinogenic plants. Jonathan mentioned today that mescaline was characterized in the 1890s. It has only been 100 years. Mescaline was characterized in the 1890s. It was the only hallucinogen until the 1920s, when in Germany there was a little bit of work with the beta-carbolines. Then that was all closed down by World War II. Hoffman discovered LSD the same weekend as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but it had no impact on science or psychiatry until the early 50s. Psilocybin was discovered in 53, characterized in 56, and everything was made illegal in 66. So the idea that Western science has somehow fully investigated these compounds and concluded that they're irrelevant or pernicious or something like that is just nonsense. This news coming out of ethnography and anthropology is very new news, and we need to get fully alerted to the fact and begin to try and figure out, what is the real relationship of these compounds to the human experience. I think one reason science is so queasy about all this is because science has spent the last 500 years exercising the idea of spirit out of matter. Spirit, the human soul, all of that, it has been progressively limited and chased down until finally, behaviorists, positivists, tell us there is no such thing. They say mind is an iridescence on metabolism, free will is an illusion, and human beings are behaviorally driven machines. Well, that kind of cheerful horseshit will just not stand in the light of the psychedelic experience. So they are very reluctant to get into this. It's one thing for anthropologists to bring back the word that shamans find lost objects, cure diseases, and can tell who's sleeping with who. It's just dismissed as, these wily shamans. They're masters of sleight of hand, essentially presented as cheap magicians. But in fact, anybody who spends field time with these people knows that natural law doesn't seem to have nearly the force that it's assumed to have by positivist reductionists. So I think science itself is in a situation of potential invalidation and compromise if it will fairly explore these things. So it's a great watershed and crisis for the Western mind. Science, the uncritical practice of science and technology, is what brought us to this mess. And the male ego is very anxious around the issue of boundary dissolution and surrender to forces larger than itself. So that's why I think, people who think these drugs are going to be legalized simply by making a cheerful case that they are metabolically benign or something like that, do not understand the depth of the issue here. The issue is not whether they're metabolically benign. The issue is whether or not they cast doubt on the most fundamental assumptions of Western civilization, which are, the preeminence of reason, the sanctity of the ego, the primacy of matter, I don't think these ideas can survive a full confrontation with the psychedelic experience. So it's an incredibly charged issue.
I would say that they absolutely can't survive because they shattered all of... See, I was once a very concrete rationalist. I had no place in me for spiritualism because I was a college-educated Western citizen, and all of that stuff didn't exist in the light of reason and the scientific method. And one experience with LSD shattered all of that, made me reevaluate from the very beginning the existence of spirituality in my life.
Yeah, that's my story exactly. I mean, I was raised Catholic, escaped through that to Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Heidegger, positivism, phenomenology, and then, came DMT, and I just realized, that the entire enterprise of Western civilization is just whistling past the graveyard. It's an infantile enterprise, and it produces infantile institutions and infantile people. All of its institutions are preposterous and toxic and absurd. I mean, culture is not your friend. It is not your friend.
Western culture denies the existence of half of the mind, I think. It completely denigrates intuitive perception.
Well, the 20th century is a slightly different case because the great century when men were gentlemen and women knew their place was the 19th century. The 20th century is more chaotic because you have, in the early years of the 20th century, you have Freud, who announces the unconscious. He gives it a sexual spin, but he does admit that, we aren't all nice little ladies and gentlemen. Drives to cannibalism, incest, and murder are right under the surface. Jung takes folklore, fairy tales, alchemy, expands all that. At the same time, the cheerful world of Newtonian physics is being turned upside down, first by relativity and then by quantum physics. The cheerful world of the pursuit of the photographic image is being busted up, first by Impressionism, then by Dada, then by Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism. Anybody who thinks the world of the gentleman is still intact is disabused of that at Auschwitz. Then comes the atom bomb. The 20th century has been a century of archaic revival. Jazz, rock and roll, psychedelic drugs, sexual permissiveness, showing of skin in fashion, tattooing, body piercing, so forth and so on. All of these things, not to judge anyone particularly, but all of them are impulses toward the archaic and against the world of the petty bourgeois materialist Christian monogamites. And it's been, one hell of a fray, and it's not over yet. But I think, that the values of the 19th century are pretty much on the run at the moment. It doesn't mean we are safe from catastrophe. We may sink into the self-created quicksand, clutching the answer above our head as we sink beneath the slime, which would be a great tragedy. But at least in the 20th century, the battle has been joined. And I see, feminism, ecological consciousness, psychedelic consciousness, house music, and I could name a bunch of other things, but you get the drift, are all facets of a new, I hate the word paradigm, but a new style of thinking that is trying, against enormous odds, to overcome the lethal momentum of Christian linear, straight thinking.
A couple of questions about the psilocybin theory of human development and evolution. First one is, why would our species have benefited inordinately or more than any other species from taking psilocybin in terms of their eyesight and sexual arousal. It seems like it would benefit any species that takes it. And
Well, let me answer that
Okay.
because of pot, I can never do two-part questions. Well, first of all, we represented one member of the group of the most advanced animals on the planet. We already had a complex pack signaling repertoire. We already had a prehensile thumb, and we were willing to experiment with our diet. Any animal with those characteristics probably would benefit from psilocybin. Raccoons fit that description, and many evolutionary biologists have said that if primates had not evolved an advanced thinking type, the raccoon line might well have. So I agree with your premise. I just think we were in a position of sufficient flexibility and previously achieved advancement that it worked for us. And the second part?
Okay. Concretely, how is it that you see? How do you see the use of psilocybin being the proximate cause in any way of the quick doubling of the size of the brain, especially since it couldn't have been due to language, since
That came
that
later.
was much more recent than the doubling of the brain size.
Well, the coordination of information causes the arborization of brain tissue. In other words, if you raise primates in a very spare and simple environment, they have much less arborization of the nervous system than if you give them lots and lots of stimulation. And I think the psilocybin provided a much more highly stimulated environment. That's the basic notion. Yeah?
Well, I was wondering, in light of what the psilocybin is capable of doing, when we look at the cultures like where we are now, the Mayan, and they had access to the mushroom, yet they had a male hierarchy, dominance, and male-driven lineage, and I guess I'm trying to figure why didn't it save them, or why did they disappear in light of having access to that?
Well, there are two possible answers. They're sort of antithetical. One is, we don't know how much psilocybin they were taking. It's a purely conjecture. I mean, you can believe anything you want. Number two, if you believe they took a lot of psilocybin, then they appear to have just walked out on city building, hierarchical social structures. Nobody knows what caused the collapse of the Mayan culture. The most probable and non-fantastic supposition was simply a slave revolt. That this was a very steep social pyramid, and people got tired of hauling rocks around on their backs so that 3% of the population could dress up in all these fancy clothes and dance on top of these buildings. I mean, people just were sick of it, and eventually they probably killed everybody who could read, and just had it. And perhaps that was an impulse toward the archaic. They said, we don't want complicated theatrical performances, blood sacrifices, and architectural projects built on the backs of the poor. We're going to go back to being small-time farmers in the rainforest, and they did. So, but this is all conjecture. I don't have a huge stake in believing that the Maya were a psilocybin-based civilization. The more we learn about the Maya as decipherment proceeds, the weirder they appear. I mean, the Mexican earth does something to these cultures, and the later wholesale blood sacrifice of the Toltecs and the Aztecs was definitely prefigured in the rites of public genital mutilation by the royalty and the cult of blood, and they were obsessed with taking and tormenting captives. I mean, it was not, I think, a society that we would be entirely comfortable with. What the New Age has done with it, the New Age will have to pay the price, because now comes decipherment. And all these people who had us believing these were, pure soul stargazing astronomers had better head for cover, because the truth is far more complex.
I've got a question.
Go for it.
I got a lot of mileage out of your presentation a year and a half ago in Santa Cruz. This theory, and I mean, I've had a lot of Faustian fears about the Great Horned Beast. And it sort of took me off the horns of the dilemma, is how I put it at the time. But your point about the apocalypse, and as you put it tonight, the battle being joy, that I sort of didn't pay as much attention to. And now that you're bringing it up again, if there's a battle being joined, and if we're in it, what's the battle plan?
Well, I think the battle plan is to simply say what's true. This whole issue of the chemical alteration of consciousness, the other side has had it all their way. I think people need to come out of the closet, and I think people need to be straight with their children and their colleagues, and it's a meme war. You all know what memes are. They're the subunits of ideas and ideologies. It's a meme war. And if the meme that drugs are perverse, distorted, and lead to a life of ruin is allowed to triumph, then this whole option will go by the wayside. If, on the other hand, drugs put you in touch with your authentic humanness, are a doorway into the Gaian mind, and strip away the false structures of the ego, then that's a different meme. And so it comes down to education and debate and authentication of these various points of view through your own experience. I mean, you should take psilocybin in large amounts and decide whether you think A is the right point of view or B is the right point of view, or come up with your own point of view. I've said many times, and I'll say it now, and then this is the last thing I'll say and go to bed. It's somewhat like sexuality. Sexuality is scripted into your existence. Very few of us can go from birth to the grave without having some kind of encounter with sexuality that we have to sort out. The psychedelic experience is also scripted into your physiology and your psychology, but unlike sex, there isn't this enormous hormonal piston pushing you inevitably toward it. Rather, you have to choose it. You have to find out about it and explore it. But it is your physiological birthright. As much as your right to have an orgasm, you have a right to have a psychedelic hierophany. And when I think of the millions of people in all times and places who've gone to the grave without ever having the inkling of the psychedelic experience, those people were infantile. They were victims of neoteny. They never actually unfolded the full toolkit of what it means to be a human being. So that's that. Anyway, we'll talk more about all of this, but thank you very much.
Thank you.